QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021 Report Formatting Basics. Let's get into it with Intuit. QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars practice file. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the View dropdown, selecting the open windows list. We're now going to practice formatting reports, general formatting options. We will do so with our standard balance sheet report, but note that these options can generally be found in most other reports as well. So these will be applicable to many reports or reports in general. We will open up our balance sheet. A couple different ways you can do so. We can go to the reports dropdown, company and financial, and down to the balance sheet in this format, or we could go to the reports dropdown, open the report center, and then go from here to the standard reports on the left-hand side tab. We want to be in the company and financial. Note that the balance sheet is going to be on the bottom, and we do have these other view options on the side. So this is the standard view, giving us a little layout. We can view them by list, which can be probably the easiest way to go and find something if you use this as your primary way of finding it. Or we can use this item, which is going to allow us to scroll through in this format, which can give us an even more detailed look than the standard view, which is going to be this layout that it defaults at. I'm going to use the list view, and then I'm going to scroll down past the balance sheet area. So we get to the balance sheet area. Here we have the balance sheet standard. I'm going to go ahead and run that report from here. I'm going to maximize the screen. Maximizing the screen, I'll change the date to 12/31/21 to start off with. When you hear customizing report in QuickBooks, your first thought would be to go here into the customize report area. That's where most of the customized items will be. However, some of those items have been pulled out and put on the ribbons for ease of use. So you might see some redundancy between the items out here and then the customized reports. And then you have some items up top as well. Some of them being customized options as well as other options like just simply printing the report and whatnot. So you've got these three basic like ribbon areas. These two are going to give you some customized options down here. This one up top gives you some more buttons. The major button for customizing the report is the Customize Report button. So let's go through some of these ribbon items first, and then we'll go through the items that are most easily used. The fact that they're out here to be most easily used would mean that QuickBooks would think that they were going to be the ones that you would use most. And then we'll go into some of the customized options and some of the general options in there. In future presentations, we'll go into more of the detailed customized options in here. Now, many of these options up top have to do with something a little bit different than customizing the reports. We will work with them in future presentations, but obviously we have things like memorizing the report. So after customizing the report, you might want to memorize the report. You might have comments on the report. So these have to do with, memorizing and commenting as opposed to basically the formatting of the report. Printing the report, we'll get into printing more in future presentations. Emailing the report, the option of how to give the report to someone else, a little bit different than the customization we're focusing in on here. Exporting to Excel, we'll talk more about that in a future presentation. Hide the header, this is somewhat of a formatting option, and you can select this option and that'll hide the header up top, which might make it a little bit easier to see all the data on one sheet. So you don't really need the header when you know you're in the balance sheet already. It says it over here in the open windows. So that might be useful as a formatting tool to use within the QuickBooks system as you're jumping back and forth. You also have the collapse rows item here. So if I select the collapse rows, then you'll see what happens is it'll collapse some of the rows. Now, as you do that, you might say, why didn't it collapse all these triangles? It only collapsed like these triangles down here. I could collapse this. Why didn't it do that? So if I look at it, if I uncollapse or expand the rows, then it collapsed this one and this one. These are things that are not set up by the type of account, but rather by subcategorization. To see that in more depth, let's go to the lists dropdown and go to the chart of accounts. And you'll notice, as we saw in the prior presentation, some of the triangles have to do with the account types over here. So we have categories like current assets, and then breaking out by account type, accounts receivable, current assets, other current assets, and then fixed assets, and so on. And then we have another triangle breaking out by subcategorization. So that subcategorization is the item that's being collapsed with that collapse item. So if I go back to the balance sheet, these items are being generated, these categories are generated by the account type, whereas this category is there by subcategorization. So if I collapse it, it will collapse these subcategorization items. So then I'm going to expand, refresh. If you do not have your system to set up refreshing automatically, then you want to refresh your data every time you go back to the report. Sometimes when people set up QuickBooks, they like it not to refresh until they tell it to. So for example, if you were to go to the home page and you entered a new transaction here, and then you went back to the balance sheet in the open windows, if you didn't want it to refresh until you hit the refresh, then you can kind of see the change basically as it happens, as opposed to it refreshing automatically. I like it to refresh automatically. You can change that option up here in the edit dropdown into preferences, and then you could go to the reports and graphs on the my preferences side, and you can refresh automatically, or you can have it prompt you to refresh, so it'll tell you, hey, I'm going to refresh right now, or the don't refresh option, in which case you would manually have to push refresh in order to refresh it. I typically have refresh automatically, so I will not be using this item too much. If it doesn't refresh, you can typically click on the report and it will refresh at that point. And if it doesn't, then you want to hit the refresh button. Remember, it's up there to make sure that your changes are there. Don't get frustrated if you're like, the change didn't happen, it didn't refresh. Use the refresh button. So then we have these items up top. Some of these will be redundant in the customized report. So we'll see them here, and then we'll go to the customized reports. We have the dates. So if you go to the default, when you open up a report, will generally be today's date. So today's date, but if you're working a practice problem like us, we often have to just enter the date that we're working in, or if you're entering data for a prior time period, if you're entering like a whole year's worth of data, then you're obviously going to have to go to prior dates as well and use the custom date type field. Now notice that this particular report has 1 day here, 1 day, because it is a balance sheet as opposed to a timing report, as we'll see when we get to the income statement, which will have to have a range, a beginning and end date. So this one date is useful, or it's all you need to actually display the report. However, if you want to drill down or use the zoom feature on the report, like if I want to see the activity for the checking account, when I zoom in, then it gives me a date range, because now I'm in a timing report, like a general ledger report, a transaction by account report, as it's called by QuickBooks. But I have no beginning date, and therefore I only have 1 day. So I have to change the date to 01/01/21 to see the detail, which is what I want to see when I zoom into the report. So closing this back out, that's why they only have 1 date here, but you still might want to enter a range so that I don't have to change the date when I drill down on the data to see the transaction detail. So some of these will have that in place. So if I have this fiscal quarter, it'll break it out by quarter, every 3 months. This fiscal year, the year to date. Now I'm working in the following year, in 2021. It's currently 2020, so I can't use the current year data. Last year data, if you want to take a look at last year information, it can default there without having to just do a custom date. And then if you want to take a look at last fiscal year, so I'll take a look at our last fiscal year here in 2019. If you take a look at the next fiscal year, then it'll go to the current year that I currently have data in, because we're going to enter this data in our practice problem in 2020. Now notice, because I did a fiscal year here, if I double click on this information, it will show me the detail, because it gives me the range of January through December. Whereas if I close this back up and I simply type in the date here, then it will not give me, it'll just give me 1 day when I go into that detail report, as we saw in the past. Now, if you do want to do a custom date up top, then you still have the option of a range, but you don't have it here. Meaning, if I just want to type in the date and I go to custom, it won't give me the range. And so what am I going to do? How do I get the range in there if I just want to type in a date? Well, you can go to customize reports here, and then you can type in the beginning and ending range. And that's what I typically do, so I can have the most control over the report I want to see, so I can drill down on the data. So if I just want to see, December, or maybe I just want to see the detail for like 02/01/21, and I want to see it through 02/15/21. And I want to, really what I'm looking for is the transaction detail. So if I close this back out, now I go into the checking account, double click on it, and I get the transaction detail for that time period. It's already restricted for me, so I don't have a whole year's worth of data in there. I can just go in here and pick up what I want without changing the dates every time I go into a transaction detailed report. Closing that back out. Then we have the dates here. We have the custom dates. We have the show columns. Now I'll change this back to 12/31/21. And then we have the show columns. So we have total only. That's the default for the balance sheet, because remember, the balance sheet is as of a point in time. And this is often the default. That's often the default. It'll have total only. But for the balance sheet, we're as of a point in time, which is just like one point rather than a range. So we're showing the total, in this case, for December 31st. In other words, if I was to change the dates here from 01/01/21 to 12/31/21, I have the same totals. My total's the 227.15 total. Let's say our total assets are 227.15. If I was to change the beginning date to something like 12/15/21, it's a shorter time period, but the number's the same, because that's where we stood as of the end of the time period. So that will be different if you basically go to an income statement. If I was to change this back, and I'm going to change it back to January 01/01/21 to December and say okay, and I would say, okay, let's see it by month now. I want to see it by month. Then it's going to give me a breakout of each month. So it'll actually say, and this is going to be where we stand at the end of each month for the balance sheet. If it were an income statement, it would tell us our performance, how we did during each month of time that had passed. So it's breaking that information out. So we can obviously do that by quarter, and that'll give us every 3 months, 4 quarters in the year, where we stood in the 4 quarters. I'm going to go back to the total. So you have, day, week, 4 months. The standard would be monthly, you would think, and quarterly. So I'm going to go back to the total year, and then you can sort by. Notice we have the default. What does that mean, the default? It sorts first by type. So these are account types. So, it sorts first by assets, liabilities, and equity, the accounting equation. Then it sorts by major balance or financial categories, current assets, for example, versus long-term assets. Current assets, then fixed assets or depreciable assets or property, plants, and equipment, standard categorizations for a balance sheet. And then it's going to sort by account type, meaning we set up the account types over here by these items. So if I go back to the balance sheet, it's in order by account type then. And then within the account type, that's when this takes effect. Within each account type, so for example, in other current assets here, we have 3 accounts. It's in order by alphabetical order. So we have inventory, prepaid, insurance, undeposited funds. Even though prepaid insurance, has more money in it, maybe we would want that on top. It's in order by the alphabetical order. How could we change that? One way we can change it is to use account numbers, which means we can use the account numbers to adjust within this category. We'll talk about that maybe after the practice problem. We won't be adding account numbers to this practice problem. Other way you can change it and have less control but a little bit more control is to say, I want to show it by total here. And then what that'll do is that if I go to the other current assets, we see now that the total is on the bottom, and you would typically want the highest number first. So I'm going to say I want it from Z to A, so Z to A total. And so now you can see in the other current assets, you have the highest number on top, then followed by the next highest number within this categorization. Now this happens to work out well because the checking account also has a total higher than the accounts receivable, and the accounts receivable total is higher than this categorization. So notice if I flip this and I go from Z to A, it actually put the highest amount on the bottom now, which means it actually recategorized the whole checking account is now on the bottom. So the assets are now in order, in category, in reverse order now than you would normally see them. So for that reason, I don't think this option is as useful as you would think. I would typically keep it on the default because typically you want it in this order. And this order happens to work because my checking account is greater than the accounts receivable. It's greater than this item. I would like to, within this categorization, possibly have my highest number on top. But maybe you don't want to do that with this technique, but keep the default and then have more flexibility to change these items with the use of account numbers. That's how I would typically do that. So typically, I'll keep that on the default. Then we have the report basis. This is something that causes a lot of confusion to people because many people will say, hey, look, I want to be on a cash basis. I'm on a cash basis. And they'll go over here and just do the cash basis. Now, general rule, unless your accountant says otherwise, unless you want to keep it on the accrual basis here. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't really conduct your bookkeeping system on a cash basis. You could still basically have a cash basis system while using the accrual item over here. In other words, for me just to click from accrual to cash does not change my full system to a complete cash basis. And for me going from cash to accrual does not simply change my whole basis to an accrual system, because it depends how I enter the data into the system. In other words, if I go back to the balance sheet or to the home tab here, if I'm entering an invoice and then receiving payment and then recording a deposit, I'm going to be on an accrual system, because the invoice means that I'm going to have to track who owes me money, and then I'm going to have to pick up that money. I'm going to have to collect on that money. Whereas if I, for example, have a system where I have a company where I'm completely dependent on the bank to record my transactions, meaning maybe I just set up my bank feeds and any deposit that I get is basically revenue, and any decrease to the checking account I'm going to assign to some type of expense. Well, that's pretty much a cash basis system at that point in time. And whether you put the financials on an accrual or a cash basis system, you're using a cash basis, right? Because you entered everything in directly from we entered everything in that case directly from the bank statement. And that might be something that you do, I mean, depending on the type of business and your bookkeeping needs. And you'll basically be on a cash basis in that way, whether you put your books on a cash basis or not. So when might you use that option? The accrual option, like if I was using this accounts receivable account, that is an accrual account. If I have accounts receivable, if I did work before I got paid and I'm trying to collect on it, then that is an accrual account. That account is being generated, or it goes up when we create an invoice. Whenever we create an invoice, that would then increase. Now, if for whatever reason I wanted to show a cash basis, even though I know I'm on an accrual basis, then I can go, if I go to the cash basis, it should remove that account. So I'm going to go to the cash basis. Now, it doesn't completely go to zero here because the inventory tracking is kind of throwing it off. So if I double click on this, for example, just to take a look at it, if we double click on the detail here, we're now on the transaction detail on a cash basis. You see this first transaction's at the 320 here for the invoice. If I go to the accrual method, it would be at the 420. So that would be the normal accounts receivable. If I go back to the cash method, it's at the 320. If I double click on that amount, then it's not on the actual invoice. It's basically because that's related to the cost of goods sold. So it's being affected. It's recording the cost of goods sold there. So I'm going to close this back out. I'm going to close this back out. But in general, the accounts receivable wouldn't be there if you're on a cash basis. So what would QuickBooks do if you toggle over from an accrual basis to a cash basis? Well, if you go back to the home page, you would say, okay, well, normally, if on an accrual basis, QuickBooks is trying to find the form that would be close enough to the point in time that you earned the revenue, because that's when you're supposed to record income on an accrual basis. And that typically is when you create the invoice. So when you create the invoice, it records revenue and the other side goes to accounts receivable. If you toggle over to a cash basis, then you're basically telling QuickBooks, hey, I'd like you to use the form that would be closer to the point when we got the money to record income. That would be the receive payment form. So in other words, even if you enter an invoice, you would think QuickBooks would then not record anything at that point in time and wait until basically the payment is received and then record the income in that time period, as well as the receiving of the payment on the other side at that point in time. And if you were to do that, you would be bypassing basically the invoice that has been entered into the system. So you'd be switching to a cash basis. In other words, or if you were on a cash basis method and you were just inputting or data input on a cash basis, you simply wouldn't enter the create the invoice. If you didn't enter the create invoice because you're not on that kind of system, you're getting money at the same point in time, you're just using sales receipts, then you're basically on a cash basis anyways, right? If I was just entering sales receipts, then I would not have an accounts receivable because I'm not using accounts receivable, and it wouldn't matter whether or not I put my books on a book basis or a cash basis because I'm just entering sales receipts. I don't have anything in accounts receivable, and I'm recording income at the point in time the work was done. It just happens to be the same point in time that I get paid because that's the type of industry that I'm in. So if I go back to the balance sheet, so typically I wouldn't use that cash basis unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Now you might want to see something on a cash flow basis, and what do you do then? Usually you look at the statement of cash flows. That's why the statement of cash flows is there to kind of convert your accrual basis system onto a cash basis so you can see, your cash flows on that statement. So typically, even if you use kind of a cash basis for data input systems, you usually want to be on accrual basis here, unless you have some reason to be going on to the cash basis. So I know I spent a lot of time on that, but that kind of causes a lot of confusion, I've noted. So if we go up to the customized reports up top, we see some more options that will be laid out in the display, filters, headers and footers, and fonts and numbers. Displays, you're going to see some of the repetitive data that we just looked at. And the filters, this has some nice options, but it's usually useful for longer reports. So we're going to get into that more when we start looking at different types of reports that we're going to filter in different ways, like transaction reports or general ledger type reports. We'll talk about headers and footers, which is going to be the layout of these items in future presentations as well, getting into more detail. And then we'll get into the fonts and numbers also in a future presentation. So we'll focus here mainly on the display options. So within the display options, you have the date range that we saw before. Same options here. It's a repetitive item to this dropdown, but now you have the custom range down below. So that's what I use a lot, this custom range, so that I can drill down on the data and use the zoom feature for the transaction detailed reports. You have the same option down here. So we have the repetitive report basis options, and then we have the columns. This is a repetitive option that we saw here. It's already up top here. And then we have the sort by, again, same information up top that we saw up top. Now then we have the add subcolumns for, and we can start to use these items down below, which is going to show us the previous period. These can be used to give us comparative reports. We can make our own comparative reports. So we'll get into more detail on the comparative reports in future presentations as well. The other feature that's nice, that's often overlooked, is in this advanced areas, and this could be useful, where it says display rows that are non-zero, or all rows, or active rows. So this means that, like, for example, if you take a look at your chart of accounts over here, I'm going to close this back out and go to the chart of accounts. We have all of these accounts, and some of these accounts will not be used, and some of them are like clearing accounts, meaning the undeposited cash, money goes into it and then goes back out of it. So it might be zero, but I still want to use the drill down or zoom feature to drill down on the detail. So I don't want it to be zero if there's transactions in it. So I might go then back to the balance sheet and say, okay, I'm going to say I want to customize, and then I go to advanced, and I might say that I'd like to see at least the active row. So even if it's zero, I want to see it there so that I can go into it, I can drill down on it. And I'm going to say okay and okay. And now, for example, I have this item here that has a zero in it, but if there was any detail in it, I can zoom in it now. I can do the zoom and I can see the transaction detail even though it's zero. So for display, so I'm going to close this back out. For display purposes, you don't really want the zeros there, but for use purposes, for your internal use when you're doing bookkeeping, it's nice to have them there because, for example, if I was to pay off the undeposited funds, that would go away. It would go to zero and it would disappear. But I want to double click on it and I want to see the detail in it. Therefore, I want to see the zeros there for the active sheets. So I'm going to go back into customize. I'm going to go to the advanced. So I would typically have the active ones there when working possibly, and then change them to zeros are gone when you display them or show them to somebody else. You can also have all columns here. So if I was to choose all of them, I could say, okay, and this could be useful if you're trying to say, like, which of these accounts am I not using, right? I'm not using some of these accounts. And oftentimes, if you've been working in this for a few months, you might have used the QuickBooks chart of accounts here by default. And then after a few months, you're going, okay, now I want to look into this and see if there's any accounts I can delete because I don't need excess accounts here. So you might then run the report with all of the zeros in there, check to make sure that you're not using those accounts and make them either delete them if you've never used them or make them inactive at that point in time. That's how I would think would be the best use for that particular option. Customize, I'm going to go to advanced. You could do the same for columns, and that would be reports like if you're displaying a detailed balance sheet report that has multiple columns in it, or something like a jobs report that has multiple columns. You might want to see all columns or just the active columns in that format as well. And then you got the reporting calendar and the fiscal year, calendar year, or income tax year options as well. I think these two are overlooked options here that that can be useful in certain circumstances. So I'm going to go back to the default of active and say OK and OK. So those are our general options. We'll get into more detail on some of the ones that that we missed or some other options in future presentations.